June 1940. The Mediterranean shimmered under the early summer sun as Benito Mussolini stood on his balcony in Rome. To the north, Hitler's panzers were crushing France. To the south lay the desert, vast, empty, and, to Mussolini's eyes, undefended. Egypt was a British protectorate, but Italy's colonial armies were already in Libya, staring across the border at a prize that seemed effortless. To Mussolini, the timing looked perfect. He had missed the first act of Hitler's war, and he wanted his share before it ended. "We need a few thousand dead," he told his generals, "so that we can sit at the peace table." Italy declared war on Britain and France on June 10, 1940. In the narrow offices of the Italian High Command, maps of North Africa were unrolled. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, commander of the 10th Army, was ordered to advance east from Libya into Egypt. His forces looked formidable on paper: 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks. But most of the tanks were slow, outdated Fiat models that would overheat in the desert. His men lacked fuel, radios, and air cover. Across the border, Britain's Middle East commander, General Archibald Wavell, had barely 36,000 troops in Egypt. Many were Australians and Indians, dug in along the frontier near Mersa Matruh. Their mission wasn't to win, just to delay. Still, Mussolini's ambition outweighed any sense of caution. He saw Egypt as the soft underbelly of the British Empire, the path to the Suez Canal, and beyond it, the riches of the Middle East. Propaganda films in Rome showed Italian soldiers advancing across endless dunes while triumphant music swelled. The truth was far less glorious. When Graziani hesitated, citing lack of logistics, Mussolini berated him as cowardly. "The British are a decadent race," he declared. "Push them into the sea." In September 1940, the Italian 10th Army began its invasion of Egypt. Act 2. Into the sand. The Italian columns rolled east across the Libyan border under a blazing sun. The men were exhausted before they even reached the frontier. Few had desert training. Their trucks broke down by the hundreds. Supply convoys trailed miles behind. After a week, Graziani halted. His advance had covered only 60 miles before he stopped at a small Egyptian town called Sidi Barrani. He built fortified camps and waited for reinforcements. Mussolini, furious, demanded progress. But Graziani knew the truth. His army was stranded. His fuel depots were far behind in Tobruk and Benghazi. His men were dehydrated, and British reconnaissance planes shadowed them daily. Wavell, meanwhile, saw an opportunity. He had just received a new commander, Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, quiet, methodical, and brilliant at maneuver warfare. O'Connor proposed a daring counterattack. Using the newly arrived Western Desert Force, only 30,000 men and a few hundred light tanks, he would strike the Italians at Sidi Barrani before they could dig in. On December 9, 1940, Operation Compass began. The British attack was swift and precise. Under cover of night, Commonwealth troops infiltrated the gaps between the Italian camps. When dawn came, artillery and tanks erupted from the desert like ghosts. The Italians were stunned. Their positions collapsed one by one. Thousands surrendered. O'Connor's advance turned into a rout. The Western Desert Force chased the Italians 500 miles west, capturing fortress after fortress. In just 8 weeks, the British destroyed 10 Italian divisions and captured 130,000 prisoners, more than 4 times their own number. London celebrated. Churchill called it one of the most remarkable military feats in history. But in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was alarmed. Italy's defeat in North Africa threatened to unravel his southern flank. If Egypt fell completely, Britain would control the Mediterranean. Hitler decided to intervene. Act 3. Rommel arrives. In February 1941, the German Afrika Korps landed in Tripoli. Its commander was a 49-year-old general named Erwin Rommel. To the men who served under him, he was charismatic, fearless, and unpredictable, a commander who would drive to the front lines himself and lead attacks from the turret of his tank. Rommel's orders were limited: stabilize the front and protect Tripoli. But he saw opportunity. Within weeks, he launched a counterattack that astonished both friend and foe. The British, stretched thin and redeploying forces to Greece, were caught off guard. The Afrika Korps advanced like lightning. Benghazi fell, then Derna, then Mekili. O'Connor, the man who had crushed the Italians, was captured. By April, British forces had retreated all the way to the Egyptian border. Only one position held firm: Tobruk. The siege of Tobruk became legendary. For 8 months, a garrison of Australian and British troops, 20,000 men, held out against relentless German and Italian assaults. The defenders called themselves the Rats of Tobruk, a name the German radio had intended as an insult. It became a badge of honor. Rommel tried again and again to break Tobruk's defenses, but the port city refused to fall. The Royal Navy and RAF supplied it by sea and air despite heavy losses. Rommel's logistics began to strain. His supply convoys from Italy were constantly harassed by British submarines and aircraft based on Malta, a tiny island that became the most bombed place on Earth. In the diaries of German officers, frustration grew. "We are fighting the desert as much as the British," one wrote. "Our tanks drown in sand, our engines choke on dust, and our fuel vanishes before we reach the battle." Through late 1941, the Desert War seesawed back and forth. The British launched Operation Crusader in November, relieving Tobruk and pushing Rommel back once more. But it was a costly, confused battle fought over hundreds of miles. Both sides learned hard lessons: that the desert devoured men and machines faster than any enemy. Act 4. Rommel's Gamble. By early 1942, the North African campaign had become a war of logistics. Whoever could supply their army across the endless desert would control the front. Rommel received reinforcements: new Panzer III and IV tanks, better anti-tank guns, and fresh Italian divisions. The British, now under General Claude Auchinleck, rebuilt their strength after the losses of Crusader. In January 1942, Rommel struck again. In a whirlwind offensive, he captured Benghazi and drove east, once again besieging Tobruk. This time, his assault succeeded. On June 21st, Tobruk fell. 33,000 Allied troops were captured. Churchill, who had flown to Cairo just days before, was devastated. "Defeat is one thing," he told reporters. "Disgrace is another." For Mussolini, Tobruk's fall was the vindication he had long awaited. He prepared to fly to Libya to witness the triumph personally, dreaming of parading through Cairo within weeks. Rommel had other ideas. Instead of waiting, he pushed forward, straight into Egypt. His forces were exhausted, his supply lines stretched, but he sensed the British were near collapse. In the blistering heat of June and July 1942, the Axis advance thundered across the desert. The next stop was a tiny railway halt west of Alexandria, El Alamein. It was here that geography would finally halt Rommel's momentum. The Qattara Depression, a vast, impassable salt marsh, anchored the southern flank. The Mediterranean lay to the north. The battlefield was a narrow corridor barely 40 miles wide. No room to maneuver, no open desert to flank through. Auchinleck knew this was the place to make a stand. The 8th Army dug in. Artillery and minefields turned the desert into a fortress. On July 1st, Rommel attacked. For 12 days, the Battle of First El Alamein raged. The Germans broke through some positions, but the British counterattacked fiercely. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Finally, Rommel's offensive stalled. His troops were exhausted, his fuel nearly gone, and reinforcements from Italy were slow to arrive. For the first time, the Desert Fox had met an enemy he could not outflank. He withdrew west to regroup. The Desert War entered a tense pause, but everyone knew it wasn't over. Act 5. The Desert Turns. In August 1942, the British Eighth Army received a new commander, Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery. Precise, calculating, and utterly confident, he took over an army that was battered but not broken. His first message to his men was blunt: there will be no more retreats. Montgomery understood what Rommel had not, that the desert favored the side that could sustain itself. He reorganized the Eighth Army completely, bringing in fresh supplies, disciplined coordination, and a sense of purpose that had been missing for months. From the Nile Delta to the front lines, Cairo crackled with new energy. American Lend-Lease convoys poured through the Red Sea, brand new Sherman tanks, Hurricanes, Spitfires, radar trucks, and fuel drums. British engineers rebuilt railways and pipelines across hundreds of miles of sand. Montgomery demanded total readiness. He would not attack until he was sure of victory. Meanwhile, Rommel's situation deteriorated. Hitler's attention had shifted to Stalingrad. The Afrika Korps now survived on crumbs. Supply convoys from Italy were slaughtered by Allied aircraft based on Malta, whose garrison had finally turned the tide of the Mediterranean. Fuel that left Naples often never reached the front. In September, Rommel fell ill. Malaria, exhaustion, and lack of rest gnawed at him. His forces were reduced to 50,000 men, barely a third of Montgomery's army, yet he refused to yield. "The desert has a way of hiding weakness," he wrote to his wife. "If we move fast and strike hard, the enemy still believes we are strong." By October 1942, both armies faced each other across minefields that stretched for miles. Montgomery knew the Germans expected a slow, cautious attack. Instead, he planned a hammer blow, a massive assault that would shatter the Axis line once and for all. Act 6. The Second Battle of El Alamein, night, October 23, 1942. The desert trembled with the thunder of 900 British guns. At exactly 21:40, they opened fire in perfect unison. The barrage stretched for 5 miles, lighting the horizon like a storm of red lightning. Montgomery's attack, Operation Lightfoot, had begun. Infantry advanced through corridors, blasted in the minefields, followed by armor and engineers. Each step forward was a fight through dust, barbed wire, and hidden mines. Axis artillery answered fiercely. German 88mm guns turned the desert into a furnace of fire. For 6 nights, the battle raged in brutal confusion. Waves of infantry crawled forward, guided by compass bearings and starlight. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Every ridge and wadi became a killing ground. Rommel, returning from sick leave midway through the battle, was horrified. His lines were buckling under relentless pressure. But he refused to retreat without orders from Hitler. "We stand or die," he radioed to Berlin. On October 25th, British armor attempted to break through at Kidney Ridge. The Germans counterattacked savagely. The battlefield became a graveyard of burning tanks. Montgomery remained calm. His strategy was attrition. Wear Rommel down until he had nothing left to fight with. By October 28th, Rommel's fuel reserves were almost gone. Many of his tanks were abandoned for lack of petrol. "We are fighting with ghosts," one German officer wrote. Then came the final blow. On the night of November 2nd, Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge. New Zealand infantry stormed the northern sector, while British tanks punched through the thinning German line. At dawn, Allied aircraft filled the sky, Spitfires, Kitty Hawks, and B-25 bombers striking relentlessly. Rommel telegraphed Hitler a final plea: "The army faces annihilation. I request permission to withdraw." Hitler's reply was cold: "There can be no thought of retreat. The army will stand fast." Rommel ignored him. On November 4th, he ordered a full retreat westward. Thousands of Italian soldiers, unable to move, were left behind to surrender. As the Axis columns fled across the desert, British troops raised their rifles in triumph. The battle was over. Churchill announced to Parliament, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was true. The tide of the entire war had turned. Act 7. The Long Retreat. Rommel's army retreated 1,400 miles across North Africa, the longest withdrawal in modern military history. The pursuit never stopped. British armoured divisions drove relentlessly, cutting off ports and ambush points. Every day the desert claimed more vehicles, more men. By January 1943, Rommel reached the borders of Tunisia, where new German and Italian reinforcements, the remnants of the Africa Corps, tried to build a defensive line. But the situation had changed completely. The Americans had landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. For the first time, the Axis were trapped between two Allied armies. Rommel fought a series of desperate delaying actions through the early months of 1943. At Kasserine Pass in February, his veterans inflicted a harsh lesson on the inexperienced Americans, but it was only a reprieve. Allied logistics, air power, and manpower were overwhelming. Fuel shortages crippled every plan. Even the vaunted German tanks could move only a few miles a day. Allied air superiority turned every daylight movement into a gamble with death. By May, the Axis position was hopeless. Surrounded and outnumbered, the remnants of the Africa Corps surrendered near Tunis. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms, the same number captured at Stalingrad only months before. The Mediterranean was now an Allied lake. Epilogue. The desert's legacy. When the guns finally fell silent, North Africa lay littered with the wreckage of empires. The desert had humbled them all. Italian ambition, German daring, and British pride. For Italy, the dream of empire was finished. Mussolini's armies, once promised easy victory, had been destroyed. Within 2 years, Italy itself would collapse under Allied invasion. For Germany, the loss of North Africa was more than territory. It was the loss of illusion. The myth of invincibility that had carried Rommel's name across the world evaporated in the sands of El Alamein. Hitler's decision to forbid retreat had condemned thousands, and his obsession with prestige over strategy had revealed the rot inside the Nazi war machine. For Britain and the Commonwealth, Alamein was redemption. It restored morale after years of defeat and proved that disciplined organization could defeat even the most brilliant opponent. For the first time, the Allies had momentum, and they would never lose it again. And for the desert itself, that endless, burning expanse stretching from the Nile to the Atlas Mountains, it had become the proving ground of modern warfare. The tactics refined there, mobility, combined arms, air-ground coordination, would shape every campaign that followed, from Normandy to the Persian Gulf. In the end, the North African campaign wasn't about sand or oil or empire. It was about endurance. The armies that learned to adapt survived. Those that clung to pride perished. When Mussolini declared war in 1940, he believed Egypt would be easy, a quick conquest to glorify his regime. But by 1943, his armies were gone, his empire shattered, and the world had changed forever. El Alamein wasn't just a battle. It was the moment when the desert itself chose who would live, who would fall, and whose empire would vanish into the sand.